Today we're really thrilled to be welcoming Professor Ansie Harding. Prof. Harding is an emeritus professor in mathematics at the University of Pretoria. Having been an academic for many years, has brought the benefit of always learning and in turn always trying to explain mathematical concepts in the simplest possible way. Her passion is the world of popular mathematics with a splash of puzzle solving thrown in. Moreover, she is a water aerobics instructor who thinks water is just the most magic thing ever. She has two grown-up daughters, one an advocate and the other a tech wizard at Twitter. This morning, she's joining us to share her work on a mathematical comparison between the Spanish flu of 1918 and COVID-19. So Prof. Harding, please do go ahead.
There you go. Hi, thanks for the introduction, Diane. So the topic for today is a mathematical comparison between the Spanish flu of 1918 and COVID-19. Now, I know mathematical is not a favorite word always, but I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. And thanks for the invite. Let's start by giving a bit of a disclaimer. I'm going to quote a lot of numbers and percentages, and be aware that this Spanish flu happened 100 years ago. So the numbers reported could be questioned, even as the numbers now. So I've tried my best to be as accurate as possible, but you are welcome to question some of the numbers. Right, let's start with this graph. I'll give context to the graph later on, but just to give a rough idea, this graph's actually from the UK, but it gives you an idea of the three waves. The first one was in what they call spring, summer of 1918, and the big one called the Black October wave came later, of course, in October. That was followed by a third wave in February of 1919, after which the Spanish flu subsided. Now, a lot has been written on the Spanish flu, and it was quite horrendous. The first case was identified in Kansas in a military camp in the USA. And of course, no one had an idea of how severe this was going to be. This was, of course, during the First World War. And from there, soldiers were sent to Europe and infected a lot of soldiers in Europe. It was at the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in June, and soldiers were then on their way back. And as they came back across the world, this virus spread. I think we can relate to what happened in South Africa. There was a ship that came to Durban and another two to Cape Town, bringing back soldiers. The Cape Town infections were terrible. The two boats arrived with soldiers infected, and nobody realized how severe this was. So they were kept for 72 hours on the ship and then released into the country. And the virus spread from railway station to railway station. In Cape Town in particular, this situation can be described. The picture in my mind is of you walk on a pavement and suddenly the person next to you drops dead. They also say that a wagon went through the streets every morning with a bell shouting, "Bring out your dead." And these were then put onto the wagon. So at some stage, 300 people in Cape Town died per day. And of course, there was this fear of, are we all going to die? Is Cape Town going to be wiped out? So that is the South African situation, but let's move on to a picture here. Two pictures, one of 1918 and one of 2021. Enjoy the two pictures, notice the differences and the similarities. I especially like the oven in the background of the right-hand picture. So the 1918 flu was basically sandwiched between two world wars, the 1914 World War I and the 1939 World War II. Respectively, 20 million people and 70 million people died in these two world wars. And somehow the 1918 flu is mistaken for its severity. I mean, it's estimated that between 20 and 100 million people died, which is quite comparable to the two world wars. You can even see in the wide range of numbers, 20 to 100, that the reporting wasn't always accurate, and we don't know exactly how many people died. What made the first part of the 20th century even worse is that in 1929 there was this Great Depression where people were unemployed, starved, and there was also the polio epidemic, the disease that crippled children, and that was also start of the 1900s into 1930. In 2021, the situation is real for us. We've come to know terms that we never used before: lockdown, work from home, wearing masks. There's a travel ban, social distancing, quarantining, ventilators, friends dying, and now finally the vaccination coming. If we quickly look at a few differences, 1918 flu is history and is not as real as COVID-19 is for us now. 1918 flu data was suppressed, and that's where the name Spanish flu came from, because in Spain, 8 million people died and they didn't have a moratorium on reporting this, as was in the case in the rest of Europe. So people thought, oh, this only happens in Spain, so let's call it the Spanish flu. Now data is shared, we get data daily, it's totally different. In 1918, of course, the technology was limited, whereas now we have abundant technology. Could you imagine what this COVID-19 pandemic would have been like if we didn't have technology? Even now, we use Zoom for this presentation. We have WhatsApp, email, communication is easy. In 1918, there was little knowledge of the viruses. In actual fact, the first inkling that there's something smaller than a bacteria was at the end of the 1800s. And a virus was only seen under an electron microscope at the end of the 1930s. So they had no idea what they were dealing with. Now we have a depth of knowledge, totally a different situation. 1918, there was no vaccine, and now vaccines are rapidly produced. Turning to numbers, the 1918 flu, there was a lot of people died in the age group 20 to 40 years old, whereas now it's more the older people over 75. I want to show you a graph, the so-called W graph. This is 1918, and just, you don't have to check the numbers, just look at the shape of the graph. It's a W curve. So this age group 20 to 40 had an increased death rate, and then also little kiddies and older people. Whereas now in 2021, you can see it leans towards the older people. It's an increasing curve, and the W shape is definitely not there. So what we're going to do after this short introduction is look at 4 fairly simple mathematical tools to compare the two pandemics. And the first of these is to answer the question, how big was the pandemic? How big is it now? And we're going to look at simple numbers and percentages. The first graph I have there is of the infection percentages worldwide. In 1918, 500 million people out of a total of 1.8 billion people were infected, roughly 28%. You'll read in the media, they say about a third of the world's population became infected. Currently, we stand at, and this was yesterday, 179 million people out of a total of 7.7 billion. So that is only 2.3%. So you can see 2.3% is minor compared to 28%. If we look at death rates, the death percentages worldwide, I've taken a number of 40 million. I showed you that it's between 20 and 100 million. So let's stick to 40 million, sort of taking the middle road. 40 million out of the world population was 1.8 billion. So that's 2.1%. At the moment, we stand at a death number of 3.9 million out of 7.7 billion. And that is a tiny 0.05%. Okay, a tenth of 0.5%. So you can see with vaccines, with the measures being taken, this doesn't really compare to what happened in 1918. We turn to the South African situation. This is an eerie cartoon designed by DC Boonsire, and it comes from the Burger of 16 October 1918. And you can see this death-like figure, and on the cloak is written Spaanse griep. The South African numbers show the following, the 1918 death percentages. And this is now the world compared to South Africa. And the picture for South Africa is not very nice. In South Africa, in a spate of 6 weeks, during that awful Black October, 300,000 people died. And the South African population at the time was 5 million. So that is 6% of the South African population died in that 6 weeks. In total, 500,000 died, which is 10%. Of those, 62% were from the Cape. So the Cape was most badly hit, and South Africa was one of the worst affected countries in the world. The world death percentage was only 2.1%, whereas the South African one was 10%, and in 6 weeks, 6%. This is quite a disturbing graph. So 300,000 dying in South Africa in 1918 is equivalent to 3.6 million people dying in South Africa today. And we stand at 60,000. So we are nowhere near 3.6 million. Right, so according to numbers and percentages, the 1918 flu was definitely worse than the COVID-19 pandemic. The second approach we're going to take is to look at the pattern. That's the pattern along which this virus spread. And here we're going to refer to graphs and curves. Okay, so there are two main growth patterns. The first one is exponential growth, and the second one is logistic growth. Exponential growth is quite vicious growth. As you can see, it just shoots up without stopping. Whereas logistic growth starts off well, but is then limited by the so-called carrying capacity. Now, if you invest money, you'd like it to grow exponentially, just increase beyond measure. If you have an epidemic, a spread of virus, the last thing you want is exponential growth. Hopefully, you'll have logistic growth, where the numbers increase and then taper down to a carrying capacity. So for money, definitely the left-hand curve. For an epidemic, definitely the right-hand curve. If you look at these two graphs together, you can see the logistic growth and the exponential growth in the beginning show more or less the same growth pattern. But then the logistic growth curve tapers off, whereas the exponential one just shoots up. So difference between the two is exponential growth is characterized by a constant percentage growth. So if you invest your money at a constant percentage growth per time period, you will have exponential growth. It's also depicted by a constant doubling time, meaning your money will double every fixed period, say every 7 years, or depending on the interest rate, however many years. There's actually a magic formula to tell you what the doubling rate is. It's 70 over R. So if you invest your money at 10%, then 70 over 10 is 7. So your money will double every 7 years. And the more doubling periods you can fit into your lifetime, the wealthier you will be. Logistic growth grows quickly at first and then slows down, and it's of course limited growth. Now, we see two curves frequently in the media. The first is the total number of cases, and that you can see hopefully forms a logistic curve. The bottom one is the daily number of cases, which peaks and then subsides again. Now, these two curves are actually linked. Mathematically, we say the derivative of the top curve, the total number of cases curve, is the bottom curve. So what do we mean by that? If you look at those orange tangent lines, they depict the gradient of the curve. So the gradient is small, and then the line becomes steep, so it's a bigger gradient, and then it becomes smaller again. And if you look at the height of the bottom curve, it's small, and then very high, and then small again. So we say that the derivative of the top graph gives you the bottom graph. Also, the fundamental theorem, of course, of calculus tells you that the area under the bottom curve up to a certain point is given by the height or the function value of the top curve. So mathematically, these two curves are absolutely linked. So if you have more than one of these waves, we have a so-called double logistic curve. You can see there's a first small wave, and the numbers shoot up and then taper off. And then a second wave comes, and the curve shoots up again and tapers off. So as soon as the logistic curves becomes more or less horizontal, it means there are no more new cases. The wave has subsided. And that is, of course, what we call flattening the curve. That's the ideal situation. No more new cases. We have flattened the curve. What happens if you have 3 waves? We know about 3 waves. We're currently experiencing the 3rd wave. Then you have a triple logistic curve. It flattens 3 times. So that's the ideal pattern. Now, let's look at a few countries. And of course, we're going to start with South Africa first of all. And you can see the daily number of cases, the top curve, and the total cases, it's the bottom curve. And you can see we're almost succeeding in flattening the curve repeatedly. We almost flattened it after the first wave, not quite, then almost flattened after the third wave, but now we're heading up again, unfortunately. So we hope to flatten the curve after this third wave. Other countries, just a few pictures here. That's the USA. The USA hasn't done that badly. Their waves aren't that separated, and therefore we have a bit of a wonky curve here at the bottom. It's almost logistic, a bit shaky, but there we go. The UK also didn't have separate waves. The second and third wave were almost combined. And again, you can see there is something that resembles a logistic growth curve. There's a bit of a dog style here right at the end, because as you know, the numbers in the UK are increasing again. Then we just look at Brazil, where it's gone totally haywire. The numbers just increase daily without stopping, and therefore there's no trace of a curve that's flattening. It is just increasing. The interesting one is India, and you know, the situation changes so quickly. I first started looking at these graphs in March, and it's been interesting how the emphasis is shifted from the States to the UK to India. But India is managing quite well at the moment. They say they experience this very severe second wave, but the second wave is subsiding now, and you can see the total cases curve resembles or is starting to resemble a double logistic curve. Then finally, the world numbers. How are we doing world-wise? Not so good. The curve, the daily cases curve, is coming down, and slowly the total cases curve is flattening, but not substantially enough yet. Okay, so that was just a picture of what happens across the world. Then we're getting back to that first curve that I showed you, and I said I'll give context to that. That first curve of the three waves actually showed the death rates, namely deaths per 100,000 people in the UK, and that was in 1918. So that's 1918, and at the bottom, I've shown you the curve of what happens in 2021, also death rates. But the bottom curve shows on the vertical axis actual numbers, and the top curve shows deaths per 100 people. So at first glance, you look at these two graphs and you think, oh, the situation is more or less the same. It's absolutely comparable. But for the bottom curve, if you think the UK has a population of about 60 million people, so if you take 1,000 people out of 60 million, it's far less than the maximum of the top curve, which is 25 per 1,000. So I thought, let me try and get these two curves on the same scale and try and compare them. And this was probably the most interesting exercise that I did. And the result is as follows. The blue curve is the 1918 deaths per 1,000. And then there's a very flat red curve at the bottom, and that's actually the deaths per 1,000. And it's so small you can't even see it, so you can't even compare the graphs. But then I multiplied by 1,000, and for the 2021 curves, I showed deaths per 1 million people. And suddenly you can compare the two graphs. The conclusion is that in 1918, there were 1,000 times more deaths than in 2021 in the UK. Now that is quite shocking. 1,000 times more, or shall I say the death rate, not the numbers, the death rate per 1,000 were 1,000 times more in 1918 than in 2021. Right, so I think that brings us to the end of the graphs and curves. And again, you can see from what I've shown you, the 1918 pandemic was worse. The third tool we're looking at is how quickly did or does the pandemic spread? How quickly does it happen? How quickly does it become bad? So you are probably all familiar with this chessboard. And you know that the story goes that the guy who invented chess became so popular with the king that he said, listen, you can have whatever you want. I really enjoy this game. Have whatever you want. And the inventor of the chess game said, just give me 1 grain of rice on the first block, 2 on the second block, 4 on the fourth block, 8 on the fourth block. So it's 1, 2, 4, 8, etc. And then the shocking discovery came that they didn't have enough rice to fill this chessboard. And here on the right, you can see the development of the number of grains. On block 4, we have 8, 5, 16, 15, 16,000. And then after 32 blocks, you have quite a large number of grains. And then on block 64 is 10 to the power 18, which is huge. They also talk of the dark second half of the chessboard, where things totally go haywire. And this is, of course, exponential growth, which in the beginning seems quite harmless, but then suddenly it starts taking its toll, and the growth is unstoppable. Now, this doubling time associated with it is how long does it take between the blocks? How long does the doubling take? How long does it take to jump from one block to the next? If it's slow, if you take your time and you jump slowly from one block to the next, then the growth won't be so severe, it won't happen so quickly. But if you jump quickly, of course, a doubling process takes place very quickly, and it becomes dangerous very quickly. And this is then this doubling time associated with an epidemic is how quickly do the numbers double. So speeding up the doubling process has severe consequences. The shorter the doubling time, the quicker the growth. And this is sort of contrary to one's intuitive feeling. So few things decrease. Well, you want your numbers to decrease. You want the infection rate to decrease. But actually, if the doubling time decreases, the process speeds up, and that's not what you want. So on 22 March 2021 in New Delhi, the following was reported in the newspaper. With a rapid rise in COVID-19 cases, the doubling time has steadily declined to 202.3 days on March 22, less than half of the 504.4 days on March 1. So again, you think, oh, something is decreased, it's good, but it's actually bad. You can see on the bottom graph on the 22nd of March, that was, the numbers were low, so you had a high doubling rate. And then in March, that is March 1, and in March 22, the situation worsened, and you had a doubling time of 202 days. What happened after that is 10th of April, it said the doubling time is now decreased to 6 days from 16 days. So now the numbers double every 6 days. So that's quite bad. And you can again see, if you look at the India curve, which you've seen before, taking us up to June 22, the doubling time was very short, and it is now much longer. Now, they say, fortunately, on the 19th of June, Mumbai's doubling rate has now improved to 720 days. That's just Mumbai, that's not the whole of India, but the situation is definitely improving. Right, let's take a look at South Africa, and we link 3 curves now. The top one is the cumulative number of COVID cases, and that's the one you've seen before, which is sort of a double logistic curve. The second one is the daily number of cases, our first 2 waves, and this developing 3rd wave. Now look at the doubling time, that's the bottom curve. If the second curve, the daily number of cases, if that reaches a peak, the doubling time reaches a minimum. And then as the numbers come down, the doubling time goes up. And now our numbers are going up, so our doubling time is coming down. And we don't really want that. In actual fact, here are figures. The doubling time of cases in South Africa was just under 1,000 days in March 2021. It was 172 days on May the 30th, 2021. Currently, June 24, that was yesterday, it's 8.9 days. So in less than 10 days, if we continue the way we are at the moment, the numbers will double. And that's quite a scary statistic. Now, what about 1918? Believe it or not, we actually have data on 1918. And it says the doubling time is estimated to have been 3 days in that Black October of 1918. A doubling time of 3 days means that it would have taken just over 93 days, that is 31 doubling periods, to infect the whole world, all 1.8 billion people. Now, I've given you the numbers there just because it's so interesting. You can see, say, on day 0, there was 1 case. On day 3, it would have doubled to 2. On day 6, it would have again doubled to 4. And in the beginning, after 27 days, well, look, after a month, after 30 days, only 512 cases. Doesn't seem like a severe pattern at all. And then if you continue, in the second month after 60 days, it's already 500,000 people. And then things go haywire. It just keeps doubling, doubling, doubling. And from day 93 to 96, it doubles from 1 billion to 2 billion. So in those 3 days, 1 billion people get infected. And this is this power of doubling. So if you can stretch out this doubling process, it's to your benefit. So we come to our fourth mathematical tool, and that is to answer the question, how contagious is it? How contagious is the spread of the virus? And here we look at the reproduction number R and the so-called term of herd immunity. Now, first let's have a look at the graph. This is in the UK, and you can see it's a particularly thick graph. This reproduction number R is quite difficult to estimate. I will explain shortly. But you can see it's thick because there's a sort of a tolerance on it. It cannot be estimated very accurately. So it's between this and that. And what all I want you to see from this graph is that it came from about 0.8 and it went up to 1.6 and then it came down to approximately 0.8 again. That's in the period June to February of last year getting into this year. So what is this reproduction number? R is the number of people an infected person goes on to infect. So if the reproduction number is 1.5, it means 10 people will infect another 15 people. Now, if this reproduction number is 2, then 2 people will go on to infect 4 people, will go on to infect 8 people, will go on to infect 16 people. And you know this spells dangerous. We're talking of doubling here. And we've come to know that the doubling is a dangerous process. On the other hand, if R is 0.5, then you go from 0.5 to 0.25 to 0.125. So if you have 100 people, they will go on to infect 50 people, which will go on to infect 25 people, will go on to infect 12.5 people, if that is possible. So if R is greater than 1, the number of infected people increases. And if R is less than 1, then the number of infected people will decrease. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a bit of mathematics. If you get lost on the way, don't worry, the last line is really the only important one. So let's start with, say, a part of the population is susceptible. Say S. So think of 0.6. 60% of the population is susceptible to infection. So this R number is intrinsic to the pandemic, to the spread. So normally, if you were to infect 10 other people, but only 60% of them are susceptible, then your reproduction number becomes an effective reproduction number of S times R. But this S times R, you want to have less than 1. Your effective reproduction number has to be less than 1 for the infections to decrease. So we can say S has to be less than 1 over R, because we divide by a positive number R. But now, if S is the number of the fraction of susceptible people, then 1 minus S is the part of the population that's immune. Think again, if 60% of the population is susceptible, 40% of the population is immune. So 1 minus 0.6 is 0.4. That's your fraction of the population that's immune. So 1 minus S, if we just do a little bit of algebra there, is then greater than 1 minus 1 over r. And this term, 1 minus 1 over r, is the fraction required for herd immunity. So that's the term that we are going to work with, 1 minus 1 over r, your fraction for herd immunity. Let's look at particular cases. In the UK, on the 18th of June, the R numbers was reported as 1.2. So the fraction 1 minus 1 over R is 1 minus 1 over 1.2, and that is 0.17. So if 17% of the population are immune, the number of infections will go down. But I know you're going to say, but it's going up now, what's happening? Well, there's a new variant that's rampant in the UK, first of all. And secondly, these things are complicated. The younger population in the UK are not vaccinated yet. And they seem to spread this virus quite quickly. So that's a UK 1918. Believe it or not, I could trace an R number for 1918. Whether it's trustworthy, we don't know, but it's reported to be 1.8. And if we work out this 1 minus 1 point R, it works out at 0.44%. That's quite high. So if 44% of the population were immune, the number of infected people would have started to decrease. And I think that's why it was so bad, because 44% is quite high of the population to become immune. Now, I'm sure you want to know what happens with the South African situation. South African situation, there's a graph of the R number, and this one is more or less given to June the 14th, and after that, it's speculative. It's quite difficult to calculate this R number, and there are various mathematical models for doing this. But currently, it's estimated at 1.3. That is on 18th of June. That's the number given. So our magic formula 1 minus 1 over R gives you 1 minus 1 over 1.3, which is 0.23. So currently, if 23% of our population become immune, the number of infections will decrease. We are nowhere near that. Our deaths or our infection numbers is 1.8 million infections. Vaccinations, 2.2 million. So if you add those two, it's 4 million people are immune. More or less, of course, because not everyone who had it was reported. So 4 million out of 60 million is around about 7%. So we're nowhere near the 23% yet. So we don't have herd immunity yet. And then finally, a bit of a prediction. In 2006, there was a prediction in a reputable journal, Emerging Infectious Diseases, and it said a pandemic virus equivalent in pathogenicity to the virus of 1918 would likely kill more than 100 million people worldwide. So in 2006, they predicted that should a recurring virus or a virus comes again, there could be 100 million people killed. Now, of course, we haven't lived through it. So is it possible? Well, where do we stand at the moment? We know in 1918, 2.1% of the world's population died, say 40 million. And 2.1% of 7.7 billion is 162 billion. So if it was the same death rate as in 1918, we would have 162 million people die. But fortunately, we only stand at 3.88 million so far. So this prediction, fortunately, has nowhere near come true yet. So I thank you for your time, and you might wonder why on earth is Elvis there. I'm not Elvis, I'm not a cat, why Elvis? Well, just sort of probably to give you a bit of hope. You know, we are all semi-depressed and you think this is really bad. Well, first of all, compared to 1918, it's not that bad. And there is life after it. Can you imagine the beginning of the 1900s, world wars, a pandemic, polio, etc. And yet in 1935, Elvis Presley was born. In 1946, Freddie Mercury was born. So just music-wise, life started again and blossomed again. So yeah, there's hope for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ansie. What a wonderful ending. You know, what a lovely takeaway message. So thank you so much. I'd like to very much invite our audience now. We've got about 75 people in our audience this morning, and I'm sure some of them have got some comments or questions. So we've got a few hands up. I think Gareth Onnott was first. So Gareth.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the talk. I guess it's a bit of a comment, but you know, if you compare the two different pandemics, we've got 100 years of human scientific evolution that separates them, and I wonder if that, like, how do you tell whether the Spanish flu, as you said, it's a bit of a misnomer, terrible, but how do you tell that that particular virus was actually more contagious? Because now our numbers may well be down because of how good we were at isolating, how good we were at spreading the disease, which may not have been because of communication. So I wonder if, like, you know, I wonder if the COVID-19 thing is actually more of a success story of human scientific evolution than it is of, you know, that actually it's just not as bad. You know what I mean? The numbers kind of might be interpreted as, oh, it's not as bad as the Spanish flu. Yeah. Well, yes, it isn't as bad in terms of numbers of deaths, but maybe it's not because it's the flu itself wasn't as bad, but rather that we're smarter.
I definitely think we're smarter. They had no sense of isolation, for example, in South Africa, but in the US, there is data about different towns that brought in isolation, quarantining, and the numbers are definitely much better. You can trace it on the internet. It's not difficult to find. So for starters, this isolating, quarantining is definitely having an effect. So we are smarter. And of course, vaccines were unknown then. So that's also a factor. I think we're more sensible. We've definitely learned in 100 years. So whether it was more contagious virus, well, the R number is pretty much the same. It was 1.8. So it wasn't that severe.
Yeah. You mentioned the vaccinations, and something which I mean, I've just recently seen myself is because we point out this the UK numbers are increasing, right? And they've had one of the most successful vaccination programs in the world. But what's interesting is, so the numbers are going up, and if you compare them to South Africa, they're always tracking per thousand, you know, that they're tracking per thousand of a population, but not the deaths. if you look at South Africa and the UK, their death is actually just going down, yet the numbers are going up. And that to me speaks of the success of the vaccination program. It's preventing the deaths. Mm.
No, you're right. You're right with respect to the death rates. I'm convinced it's because of the vaccinations.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Gareth. We've got a raised hand from Arun Bisham.
Hi, Ansie. A very clear and wonderful talk. Thank you. Just 3 quick points. One is when you were dealing with the numbers, you didn't take into account the positivity rates, which I think have to be factored in. Then in South Africa, you know, can you give...
Just say again, what about the positivity rates?
You have to take into account positivity rate when you're dealing with numbers, not only numbers by themselves, the numbers that are infected, because it also depends on the positivity rate. In other words, the fraction of those who are tested, because obviously if you're testing more, then you're likely to get higher numbers.
No, of course.
Yes, and then do you have any estimate of when we are likely to achieve herd immunity in South Africa, taking into account all factors?
No idea. No, I think that would be absolutely audacious of me to make any prediction.
Yes, and then one final point. I think if you look at the Spanish flu of 1918, at that time, I don't think they had vaccinations, etc., etc. So you can basically say that they did nothing and just basically waited till herd immunity kicked in. I don't remember exactly how long the Spanish flu lasted, but just assuming a hypothetical case where at present, if we did nothing for the COVID-19, would we have achieved herd immunity by now? Obviously, more people may have died, but would we have achieved herd immunity by now?
Yeah, of course, it's not for me to say whether we would have achieved herd immunity. The Spanish flu took more or less 2 years to totally subside. And I'm sure if we wait 2 years and do nothing, we would also have a fair chance of herd immunity. But of course, we're wiser and we want it quicker. Okay, I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think it's for me to speculate about the herd immunity had we not vaccinated, had we not isolated, etc.
Thank you, Ansie.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Arun. David Rose, would you like to come forward?
Hi, Prof. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Following on for what you were saying, this is two-part question. To what factors can it be attributed that the 1918 flu eventually subsided, or basically came to nothing? And more especially, as the previous question said, they didn't have vaccines, they weren't locking down, they weren't keeping separate masks, etc. So how did it die off? Because at the moment we're already into about 1.5 years with all these extra measures. And the second question was, have you done any comparisons by province? Because obviously Gauteng at the moment is experiencing a incredible rate of increase, and at a previous stage, the Western and Eastern Cape were going through similar far higher rates or far higher numbers than what we saw in other provinces.
Okay, your first question about the herd immunity, I think every pandemic has sort of a natural run, and herd immunity is eventually achieved. And I would imagine, because it was so vicious in 1918, that could be the reason why herd immunity was achieved quicker, because it spread so quicker. Everything was accelerated. Whereas this pandemic is not as severe. It develops more slowly. The doubling time is slower. And therefore, I don't think we're going to achieve herd immunity that quickly. It will be improved through the vaccination process. But otherwise, it's also depends on how contagious it is. What was your second question? Have I done any investigation into particular provinces, etc.? No, definitely not. As I say, it changes so quickly. It's amazing if you look at the data of a month ago and now. So no, I haven't done anything on a specific region.
Sorry, thanks. Just to add to one thing that you were talking about, the original question, there is a feeling that this pandemic is caused by man-made intervention, and I assume the 1918 was purely natural. Has that sort of consideration been taken into account? If it's not a natural pandemic, then we might be stuck with it forever, regardless of herd immunity.
Yes, I must tell you, the origin of the 1918 flu is also shrouded in mystery. You know, I've read that it originated in Alaska, that a boat arrived in Alaska and had this virus on, and then it spread through America and was eventually identified in Kansas. I also read that they think it may even have come from China, like they say this new virus came. And of course, all these theories are rife, whether they're conspiracy theories, who knows? Yeah, I don't know. I can't answer your question. Where does it come from? Was the 1918 one natural? Was this one man-made? Who knows? I don't think I'm in a position to answer that. I think, again, it would be far-fetched for me to venture an opinion.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great, thank you. I think it's Gideon from WITS. Hi, Gideon.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for a very good talk.
Thank you.
I am impressed by the simplicity, yet you touching on the important aspects. I began teaching a course in modeling this year to the third-year students, and part of the topic was on modeling infectious diseases. And I remember stumbling upon a data in 1918 from which one was able to compute the recovery time, that is the time for which one is infectious.
Yeah.
And it turned out that the time for which one is can infect others is much smaller with the Spanish flu as compared to the COVID-19. For COVID-19, it takes about 10 days to 14, isn't it? But for the Spanish flu, it seems much less than that. And I wonder how that informs the spread, because it then speaks to the fact that COVID-19, given the longer duration for which one is infectious, it means that I would expect to have a larger proportion of people getting infected compared to the Spanish flu. And I wonder how that fits into your talk.
Yeah, you must also keep in mind that the Spanish flu, most of the deaths happened almost within a day. People, the lungs filled with this frothy, bloody substance, and they basically suffocated within a day. So it was quick, whereas now it's definitely not as quick. So it's one of the differences. Being contagious, I'm not sure that it's 10 days. You know, the 10 days is the period they prescribe until you're clear. And there's a safety factor built in there. So what does your data say? What is the time of infection of 1918?
It talks about it being about 3 days. 3 days, which can, well, mathematically speaking, one can work it out as about 3 days.
Yeah. Well, it's possible. I mean, but what exactly is your point, that you think that's the reason why our pandemic is not as bad as the 1918, or the other way around?
Yeah, I was expecting this pandemic to be more severe, but your response answers the question, which is that people die immediately in 1918. The death was instantaneous compared to now.
Yeah, it was far more vicious.
Yeah.
And that's why they say you walk in the street and the person next to you drops dead. It's a terribly scary thing to happen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gideon.
Tim Egan from UCT. I just had a few comments and also a couple of questions. One comment, I guess, with regards to herd immunity is it assumes that infection results in long-lasting immunity, which seems to still be a question mark. So I guess that affects the model. So that was just really a comment. But the other question I had is the fact that the R value changes so much.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't seem to be a constant value, and I assume that's behavioral or something.
Yes, these things are all interdependent. You know, depending, of course, if you isolate, then your R number will go down because you get into contact with fewer people. So that's a factor. So the R number changes continuously. It's like in the UK at the moment, it was actually down to less than 1. And now it's crept up again. It was 1.1 and the latest it's 1.2. So yes, it changes, and it depends on this new strain in the UK is probably more infectious than the previous one. So it pushes up the R number. So the R number is the most, shall I say, woolly, difficult to handle number of all. It's also very difficult to estimate it. You know, in the beginning, you had to report if you're infected, how many other people did you get into contact with. At the moment, it's so rampant that that's not a sensible thing to do. So they have to resort to other means, numbers admitted to hospital, etc., etc.
Yes,
so it's not a simple thing.
It also seems to be influenced by some people being super spreaders and others not really spreading the disease very much at all.
Yes. Yes.
It's heterogeneous.
I know of people who've been in close contact with infected people and then they just don't get infected at all.
Yeah.
It happens.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your question.
I just want to read out some comments here from Greg Becker. He's made a few comments, and the first one is that it's insightful to compare pandemics. You know, we can really learn from them, you know, including SARS, Ebola, swine flu. His second comment is that when comparing countries, he thinks it's very important to consider the age standardized rates of infection and conversions to death. His third comment is the R number is a great statistic that captures a few things, including the differences between infectivity between illnesses and the impact of interventions. such as behavior change, social distancing, and mask wearing. And his last comment says the global burden of disease shows that different regions have completely different causes of death. COVID is most likely to be the largest source of communicable disease death in the rich world, but not in sub-Saharan Africa.